Welcome back. What you're about to hear isn't a campfire tale. It's a documented mystery that haunts local authorities to this day. Imagine a dense, isolated jungle in Southeast Asia, miles from any known trail. A search party is looking for a missing hiker. They find his campsite completely intact, tent zipped up, food untouched. But what's creepy is the camera they find 50 yards away. The final photo, time-stamped just minutes after his last message, shows only darkness and two small glowing red eyes. We'll find out what was staring back at him. Subscribe and don't miss this revelation. The forest of Aokigahara. For 3 years, Satoshi had been a ghost. He was a functional, precise, and utterly hollow apparition haunting the steel and glass canyons of Shinjuku. His life, once a structured ascent, a project plan scaling towards clearly defined deliverables, had become a perfect, sterile loop. His apartment was on the 34th floor, a minimalist cube of white walls and smart glass that overlooked the ceaseless, silent ballet of Tokyo's traffic. By 6 a.m, he was up. By 6:30, he was on a train so packed that his body moved only with the press of the crowd, a single molecule in an anonymous tide. By 8 a.m, he was at his desk, a senior data architect for a firm that quantified global logistics. He translated the movement of millions of tons of cargo into clean, predictable algorithms. He was, by all external metrics, a success. He was 32 years old, financially secure, and respected in his field, and he was completely, profoundly empty. The emptiness had a specific date, the day the police called him at his desk to inform him that a drunk driver, asleep at the wheel of a 2-ton truck, had erased his family from the world, his father, his mother, and his younger sister, Hana, all of them, gone in the space of a single screeching metallic chord. The first year was a blur of black suits, incense, and paperwork. The second year was a wasteland of silent dinners for one and weekend projects to optimize his home network, simply to fill the deafening quiet. Now, in the third year, the grief had metastasized. It was no longer a sharp pain, but a chronic condition. A decay. His ordinary life, so meticulously constructed, was rotting from the inside out. He still went to team meetings, his face arranged into a mask of professional interest. He still nodded at his bucho. He still collected his pay. But he, Satoshi, was not there. He was a phantom limb, still going through the motions of a life that was no longer attached to a body. His only remaining anchor, his one point of uncorrupted data, was a photograph. It sat in a simple brushed metal frame on his desk. Hana, aged 19, laughing into the camera. She was wearing a ridiculous yellow bucket hat on their last trip to Kamakura, her eyes, bright with a kind of fierce, uncomplicated joy, were fixed on him, in the photo. He was the one holding the camera. He was the one she was laughing for. He would look at that photo 10, 20 times a day. He'd trace the line of her smile with his eyes. He'd try to remember the sound of that laugh, but the memory had become thin. A poor quality recording played too many times. The ghost in the machine of his life might have continued indefinitely, a background process running until his hardware failed. But then, the dream started. It wasn't a narrative, it was a sensory summons. It began as a feeling of damp. He would wake precisely at 3:15 a.m., his sterile, climate-controlled apartment suddenly smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. He'd feel a profound, impossible cold, not on his skin, but inside his bones. Then came the sound, a whisper. It was not a voice, and it spoke no words. It was the shape of a whisper, the sound of air moving through a billion wet leaves, and it seemed to form a single, impossible word. Come. The first week. He dismissed it as stress. He increased his meditation time and cut out caffeine after 4 p.m. The second week. The dream solidified. He was no longer in his bed. He was standing, barefoot, on a carpet of thick, green moss. The ground beneath was uneven, not soft earth, but hard, gnarled shapes, volcanic rock. Above him, the sky was gone, blotted out by a canopy so thick it choked the light. And the whisper was there, closer now. Come. The third week, he saw her, not Hana, not her body, but her presence. A flicker of movement at the edge of his perception, the same yellow as her bucket hat. A flash of impossible, vibrant colour in the suffocating green and black. He tried to follow, but his feet were frozen, rooted to the mossy stone. He would wake up with his heart hammering, his sheets damp with a cold sweat that did not feel his own. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a programmer spotting a fatal flaw in his own code. Where the dream was set, Aokigahara. He knew the name. Every Japanese person did. The sea of trees. The forest at the base of Mount Fuji. The place where the yurei, the spirits of the dead, lingered. The perfect place to die. He was not a superstitious man. He was a man of logic, of data sets and predictable outcomes. But the logic of his life was broken. The data was corrupted. His grief was a vast, irrational variable that had finally, fatally, broken his equation. The calling was not a request. It was an instruction. On a Tuesday morning, he did not get on the 6:30 a.m. train. He did not go to his desk. He went to Shinjuku Station and, in the sterile hum of the vast terminal, he bought a one-way ticket on the Chuo line, heading west. He sent one email to his boss: family emergency, indefinite leave. He didn't check for a reply. He went back to his apartment. The ghost looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of the 34th floor window. He packed a small bag, a water bottle, a warm jacket, a flashlight. He left his phone on the kitchen counter. He left his laptop. He left the keys. He carefully removed the photograph of Hana from its frame. He slipped the glossy square into the breast pocket of his jacket, the one directly over his heart. Then he walked out the door, the automatic lock clicking shut behind him with a final, definitive thud. The journey was a gradual unwinding. The dense, vertical city of Tokyo gave way to the sprawling suburbs, which in turn dissolved into rolling hills and small, neat farms. The train emptied, carriage by carriage, until it was just him and a few old women. The digital chime announcing the stops was replaced by the simple, mechanical rumble of the wheels. He took a bus from Kawaguchiko Station. The other passengers were hikers, bright in their technical gear, chattering about trails and summit views. They were headed for the bright, aspiring face of Mount Fuji. He was not. He got off at the stop for the Aokigahara entrance. The hikers were gone. The air was different here, sharper, colder. A large wooden sign stood near the trailhead, the characters painted in stark black. Your life is a precious gift from your parents. Please think of them and your family. You don't have to suffer alone. Call us. A helpline number was listed below. Satoshi stared at the sign for a full minute. His family was gone. His life was not a gift. It was a burden. He was not suffering alone. His suffering was the only thing that proved he was still alive. He turned from the sign and walked past the barrier. He stepped off the manicured path and onto the dark earth. The transition was immediate. It was not like walking into a normal forest. It was like stepping into a soundproof room. One moment, the world was present. The distant rumble of the road, the breeze in the upper branches, the high-pitched call of a distant bird. The next, it was gone. The trees, beech, hemlock, and twisted, white-barked cypress grew with a desperate, chaotic energy. Their roots did not go down. They could not. They clawed sideways, crawling over the black, volcanic rock that formed the forest floor. The ground was a tangled, uneven mass of roots and stone, all of it covered in a thick, wet blanket of moss. The light died. The sun, so bright at the entrance, was now just a weak, greenish smear filtered through the dense ceiling of leaves. He walked for 10 minutes, pushing past low branches. The silence grew. It became a substance, a physical presence that filled his ears. He stopped, holding his breath. He listened. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was the presence of a void, a deep, resonant emptiness that hummed at a frequency below hearing. The silence pressed against his eardrums, a physical weight, a heavy, woolen blanket smothering the world. He strained, listening for the normal chatter of a forest, the scurry of a small animal, the snap of a twig, the flutter of a wing. But there was nothing, not an echo, not a call. He couldn't hear the birds. A shiver, entirely separate from the cold, traced its way up his spine. This was it. This was the place from his dream. He checked his compass. A small, high-quality keychain model he'd had for years. The needle swung lazily, then pointed south, then east, then spun in a slow, useless circle. The volcanic rock, rich with magnetic iron, rendered it useless. He was officially untethered. No phone, no compass, no path. He was exactly what the warning signs feared. A flicker of panic, the first real emotion he'd felt in months, tightened his chest. He was lost. He could die here. But the panic subsided, replaced by a strange, cold calm. He was lost. He had been lost for 3 years, floating in the sterile void of his 34th floor apartment. Here, at least, the void was real. It was honest. He pushed deeper into the sea of trees. The ground was treacherous, the moss hiding deep crevices in the rock. He moved slowly, methodically. His old life, the life of optimized speed, was useless here. This place demanded patience. It demanded surrender. An hour passed. The green-black world was monotonous. Every tree looked the same. Every patch of moss, every gnarled root seemed to be a perfect copy of the last. It was a natural labyrinth, designed to confuse, to demoralize, to trap. He felt the cold again, the one from his dream, seeping into him from the soles of his boots. He zipped his jacket higher, his fingers brushing the sharp corner of the photograph in his breast pocket. He pulled it out. Hannah's face, laughing in the Kamakura sun. It looked alien here, a piece of impossible, saturated colour in this monochrome world. "Hannah," he said. His voice was a shock, a dry, rasping tear in the fabric of the silence. "I'm here." He wasn't speaking to the photo. He was speaking to the forest. He stood for a long time, just holding the image, letting the silence settle back around his voice. The panic was gone. The cold calm remained. And beneath it, something new, a pull. It was the whisper from his dream, but he wasn't asleep. It was no longer a sound in his head, but a tangible, invisible vector. It was a magnetic north, realigning his purpose. It was pulling him forward deeper into the Jukai. He put the photo back in his pocket, placing his hand over it. He was no longer a man of logic. He was no longer a ghost in a machine. He was a pilgrim, and he had just crossed the threshold. Satoshi took a breath, the damp, ancient air filling his lungs. He looked into the endless, tangled gloom, and for the first time in 3 years, he knew exactly where he was going. He took his next step, following the invisible call. The woman in white, Mukdil, Chuent tu Tumli Sanking Zi, Dao Cao Chow. The woods were not welcoming. This wasn't the manicured, National Trust-approved version of the English countryside. This was something older, something that predated footpaths and brightly coloured plastic waymarkers. Satoshi hadn't intended to be this deep. He was a man of calculated risks, a man who built systems to mitigate failure. This was a failure. He'd started on the track. A 3-hour loop pitched to him by a lifestyle blog as the perfect digital detox for the overstressed entrepreneur. For the first hour, it had been precisely that. The air was crisp. The ancient beaches formed a cathedral-like canopy, and the signal on his mobile had blessedly, dropped to 1 bar before vanishing entirely. He was disconnected. He was in control. Then, he tried to take a shortcut. It was the hubris of the modern man, the belief that a straight line was always more efficient. The shortcut had been a deer track, which had dissolved into a game trail, which had then vanished entirely into a morass of brambles and ferns. Now, the sun was beginning to dip, and the cathedral of light had become a claustrophobic, oppressive weight. The air was thick, heavy, and still, too still. No birdsong, no scuttling of woodland creatures, just the damp, loamy smell of decay and his own breathing, which was becoming embarrassingly ragged. Right, he muttered, pulling his jacket tighter. It was an expensive, technical bit of kit, but it felt flimsy against the sudden, penetrating chill. Get a grip. Satoshi. He pulled out his mobile. The screen was a black, reflective mirror showing him a strained, pale face. No signal. Of course. The battery icon glowed a spiteful red. 10%. He activated the torch, casting a weak, bluish-white beam into the encroaching gloom. It was a pathetic little weapon against the vast, ancient darkness pooling between the trees. The light didn't penetrate the woods. It just seemed to get absorbed. He turned in a slow circle. Every tree looked identical. Every shadow seemed to be the same impenetrable wall of black. A genuine, atavistic spike of panic, hot and acidic, pricked at the base of his skull. This wasn't inconvenience. This was danger. This was the sort of stupid, ignoble end that befell idiots in cheap horror films. City bloke, 34, found dead of exposure after ignoring path. He could practically write the Daily Mail headline himself. He took a breath. Okay, logic. Water flows downhill. Find a stream. Follow it. That's the rule. He started walking, forcing a purpose into his stride. He pushed through low-hanging branches that snagged at his hair, his feet sinking into patches of mulch that felt disturbingly like wet cement. The silence was the worst part. It was an active, pressing thing, a vacuum that seemed to suck all thought from his head, leaving only the sound. The sound, thump, 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 thump. His own heart. It was suddenly obscenely loud, a frantic drum against his ribs, as if trying to beat its way out. The rhythm was all wrong. It was too fast, a panicked rabbit in a snare. He stopped, trying to control it, pressing a hand to his chest. Calm down, you're just... Turned around, and it was in that self-imposed silence, in the gap between one frantic heartbeat and the next, that he heard it. Help me! It was a whisper, so faint. It was barely more than the rustle of leaves. A woman's voice, thin and reedy. Satoshi froze, every nerve ending, already primed by his isolation, sizzled. Hello, he called out, his own voice sounding rough and alien. The silence rushed back in, thicker this time. He must have imagined it. Auditory hallucination, stress, dehydration. His logical mind supplied a dozen plausible explanations. He was a content creator. He knew how to build a narrative. And this was just his brain, stressed and suggestible, creating one. Help me. This time, it was clearer, closer, to his left. It was unmistakably a plea, laced with a desperate, shivering terror. Hello, he shouted, louder. I'm here. Where are you? He plunged off his arbitrary path, his mobile torch slicing through the undergrowth. All thoughts of being lost were gone, replaced by the singular, driving mission of the false rescue. Someone else was in trouble. Someone else was worse off than him. This, he understood. This was a problem he could solve. Keep talking, he yelled, crashing through a thicket of ferns. I'm coming. Help me. The voice was a phantom, a will-o'-the-wisp. It was always just ahead, just beyond the next knot of ancient oaks. The woods seemed to twist around him, the trees closing ranks, their branches lashing at his face like thorny whips. The ground was treacherous, a carpet of slick, rotting leaves over hidden roots that seemed to grab at his ankles. Thump, 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 thump. His heart was a metronome for this nightmare, setting a frantic, accelerating pace. He was breathing in gulps, tasting copper and damp earth. Help me! It was right there, right there. He burst through a curtain of hanging moss and stumbled into a small clearing. He almost fell, catching himself on the slick bark of a dead yew, and he saw her. She was standing in the center of the clearing, her back to him. The first overwhelming sensation was one of pure, unadulterated cognitive dissonance. She was a slash of white against the muddy, chaotic greens and browns of the forest. She wore a simple white dress, something that looked impossibly clean, impossibly out of place. It was old, perhaps Edwardian in cut, with long sleeves and a high neck. Her hair, a cascade of jet black, hung straight down to her waist, stark and severe. She was perfectly, unnaturally still. "My God!" Satoshi panted, leaning against the tree. Are you all right?" She didn't move. She didn't turn. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the frantic, stupid thumping of his heart. "Miss," he said, pushing himself upright, taking a cautious step. The air in the clearing was freezing, a pocket of absolute zero that bit at his exposed skin. "I heard you calling for help. Are you hurt?" She remained a statue. This, his brain screamed, was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The woman, the dress, the impossible stillness. The psychological unease he'd felt before was now mutating, blossoming into a cold, specific dread. The person you were coming to rescue wasn't supposed to be this. "Look, I'm a bit lost myself," he said, trying to inject normalcy into a situation that was bleeding it dry. He took another step. The ground was soft, and his boot made a sickening, sucking sound. We need to find the path. My mobile's dead. But help me!" It wasn't the voice he'd been chasing. That voice had been a desperate, echoing plea. This was a whisper, a flat, dead, close proximity whisper. It had no echo. It simply landed in the air between them and died. He was 10 feet away, then 5. The back of her head was a void of black hair. He could smell something now, under the loam and decay, a cloying, sickly sweet smell, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice barely a croak. "Please, just turn around." Thump, 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 thump. The sound of his heart was so loud. He wondered if she could hear it. He wondered if that was what she was listening to. He reached out a trembling hand. This was the point of no return. The "help me" echoed in his memory. But it was a recording, a lure. He knew it. His hindbrain, the old, animal part of him, was screaming, "Run!" But the logical, modern man, the one who solves problems and helps people, couldn't. He had to see. He had to complete the action. His fingers, numb with cold, brushed the fabric of her shoulder. It was damp and impossibly, dreadfully cold. She didn't turn. She rotated. There was no human movement, no shift of weight. It was a mechanical, grinding pivot, like a mannequin on a rusty turntable. The sound was dry, a tiny, awful crack click of vertebrae. His hand was still on her shoulder. He couldn't pull it back. He was frozen, a witness to an unveiling he had demanded. She came around, and his logic simply shattered. It broke into 1,000 pieces and blew away like ash. The face reveal was not a reveal. It was an erasure. Where her eyes should have been, there were only 2 gaping, perfectly round sockets. They weren't empty. They were full, overflowing with a thick, oily, black fluid that seemed to pulse and writhe, a liquid darkness that defied gravity. It didn't reflect his torchlight. It devoured it. Her skin was the colour of bleached parchment, stretched tight over a skull that was subtly, horrifyingly wrong. And the mouth. She smiled. It wasn't a smile. It was a geological event. Her jaw unhinged, dropping far, far too low, and her lips peeled back to reveal teeth. Not human teeth, not animal teeth. It was a forest of needles, hundreds of them, sharp, translucent, and angled inwards, like the serrated fangs of a deep-sea predator, row upon row of them, receding into a black, cavernous gullet from which the putrid smell of lilies and old graves billowed like a physical force. The world went silent. The thump-thump of his heart stopped. Everything stopped. His lungs seized. His blood froze. He was a creature pinned to a board, every biological function suspended by an image so profoundly anti-life that his very system was rejecting it. And then, from that horrifying, needle-filled abyss, a sound emerged. It was his voice, or a perfect, hollow mimicry of it. "Help me!" It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a call. It was a label. It was the sound of the lure. It was the name of the trap. It was the last thing the last person had said. The spell broke. Satoshi didn't scream. The sound he made was a raw, primitive grunt of air exploding from his lungs as his system rebooted into its one primal directive: survive. He didn't turn. He just fell backwards, scrambling away, his hands sinking into the muck. The thing in the white dress, the woman, didn't lunge. It just watched him, that impossible, serrated smile fixed, the black tar in its eyes welling over and tracing clean, black lines down its porcelain cheeks. He was on his feet. He didn't know how. He wasn't running. He was fleeing. It was a different kind of movement. It was pure, atavistic panic, a bodily function that bypassed the conscious mind entirely. He plunged back into the trees, into the darkness that had seemed so terrifying moments before. Now, it was a sanctuary. "Help me!" The shriek echoed through the woods, but it was no longer a woman's voice. It was a chorus, a dozen, 100, 1,000 voices, all screaming the same words, overlapping, distorting, turning the phrase into a percussive, maddening wall of sound. "Help! Help me! Help me! Help me!" The sound was everywhere. It was inside his head. It was the beat. The woods themselves were screaming. Thump, 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 thump. His heart was back. A runaway train threatening to explode in his chest. He could hear something else, too. A wet, slapping sound behind him. It wasn't running. It wasn't even walking. It was just coming. It was effortless. It didn't need to run. "No, no, no. Oh God, no," he babbled, tears of pure terror streaming down his face, freezing on his skin. The branches were no longer just branches. They were arms, skeletal and barbed, grabbing at his clothes, his face. The roots were snares, coiling around his ankles, trying to trip him, to hold him. The forest was awake, and it was complicit. It was holding him down for the feast. He looked back. He shouldn't have looked back. It was there, not 20 feet behind. It was drifting over the forest floor, its white dress still pristine, its black hole eyes fixed on him, its shark-toothed mouth open in a silent, ecstatic laugh. He screamed, a high, thin sound that was immediately swallowed by the cacophony of "Help me!" He turned his head forward, and his foot caught. It wasn't a root. It was nothing. The ground was simply gone. He hadn't been running on a path. He'd been running on the edge of a precipice, a chasm, a black wound in the earth that hadn't been there a second ago. His momentum was too great. His body, propelled by sheer terror, was a projectile. He was a man of systems, of control. And in that final microsecond, his mind registered the terminal. Systemic failure. He didn't stumble. He flew. He was out, over the blackness. A single, perfect, weightless moment. Then, the fall into darkness. The sound of his own scream was ripped from his throat. A finite noise in an infinite space. He flailed, his fingers scrabbling, finding only cold, empty air. The rock face he scraped was damp and crumbly, offering no purchase. And as he fell, the sound vanished. Vanished. It didn't fade. It was cut, as if a universal mute button had been pressed. The chorus of "Help me," gone. The thump of his heart, gone. The wind rushing past his ears, gone. His own scream gone. There was only the silence, a profound, absolute, and terrifyingly heavy silence. It was the sound of the void, the sound of the grave, the sound of a place that light and logic had never touched. He was falling, or was he? The darkness was so complete, so total, that all sense of motion, all sense of self, was erased. He was just suspended, a disembodied consciousness in a thick, velvety, and impossibly cold null. He was nothing, and in that final, silent, endless moment, as the last vestiges of who Satoshi was dissolved, he realized the horror wasn't the fall. It was the sudden, undeniable sensation that something far below in that absolute silent dark had just looked up. Between life and death, the first sensation was not pain, but release, a profound, crushing release, as if a weight he had carried on his back his entire adult life had not just been lifted, but vaporized. The second sensation was silence, a thick, pressurized, subterranean silence that pushed against his eardrums. It was not an absence of sound, but the sound of absolute stillness. Satoshi opened his eyes. There was no ceiling, no bed, no white hospital walls or beeping machinery. There was only color, a color he had never seen, yet had always known. It was the deep, bruised, purple grey of a twilight that had given up on waiting for the night. It was the color of an old photograph, of faded ink on a forgotten contract, of an electrical storm moments before the first strike. The light, if it could be called that, came from nowhere and from everywhere, bathing all things in this single, monotonous, melancholic hue. He was standing. Though he had no memory of rising, he looked down. The ground, or what served as a floor, was indistinct. It was not solid, not liquid, not gas. It was like standing on packed ash, or a cloud that had been compressed for millennia. It yielded nothing, yet it offered no firm purchase. He raised a hand. It was his hand, but it was pale, almost translucent, the skin glowing with a faint, internal phosphorescence. He tried to make a fist, but the muscles felt distant. The command travelling an infinite, syrupy void. He felt disconnected, a passenger in a vessel he no longer commanded. He was in the liminal world, the space between, the waiting room at the end of all things. This was not the chaos of failure or the triumph of success. This was the grey, passionless state of maintenance. The project was over, the work was shipped, and this was the long, featureless eternity of just being. The thought sent a cold flicker through him, a sensation that was not quite fear, but its older, more patient cousin, dread. Then, he realized he was not alone. They emerged from this purple-grey fog not by walking, but by resolving, like images slowly coming into focus. At first, they were just shapes, subtle disturbances in the mist. Then, they were figures, dozens, then hundreds, all draped in a uniform, brilliant, impossible white. It was not the white of cloth, but the white of pure, sterile light, a white that pulsed with a slow, gentle rhythm, like the idle screen of a sleeping computer. They formed a circle around him, an audience, a jury, a board of directors. They had no faces, where features should have been. There was only a brighter, smoother concentration of the same white light. Yet, despite their featurelessness, he felt their collective gaze. It was not hostile. It was not welcoming. It was, perhaps worst of all, simply attentive. They were here to observe, to witness the outcome of a process. Satoshi tried to speak. "Where am I?" The words formed in his mind, but his lips did not move. He had no breath. He realized with a sudden, hollow shock that he did not need to breathe. The relentless metabolic engine that had demanded fuel and rest and air, the engine of the hustle, the grind, the 20-hour workdays, was still. A space opened in the silent, white-robed crowd. One figure stepped forward. This one was different. He was not made of light. He was solid. He was dressed in a suit, a perfectly tailored, immaculate suit of an indeterminate grey. It was the grey of charcoal, of ash, of smoke, and of steel, all woven into a single seamless garment. He was of average height, average build, with his hands clasped calmly behind his back. Satoshi knew him. The recognition was a physical blow, a gasp of non-existent air. It was the man from the train, the man with the grey suit, the stranger he had seen just before. Before what? Before the noise, and the metal, and the sudden crushing quiet. The man whose calm, professional detachment had seemed so alien in the frantic, living world. Here, in this world, he was the only one who made sense. He was the administrator, the auditor, the COO of this final, silent enterprise. The man in the grey suit stopped a few feet away. He did not look at Satoshi, but rather at him. As if a doctor were observing a symptom, he didn't speak. The voice, when it came, did not come from him. It came from everywhere. It was the collective, echoing whisper of the 100 white figures, speaking in perfect, chorus-like unison. The sound seemed to vibrate inside Satoshi's very bones, a sound imbued with a gentle, final reverb. "You have been calling us." The statement hung in the dense, purple air. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, an invoice being read. "Calling you," Satoshi projected the thought, his first act of will in this place. I don't know you. I was busy. I was working." The man in the grey suit tilted his head, a gesture of mild, clinical curiosity. The chorus spoke again, the sound washing over him like a cold tide. "You called for us every time you chose the work over your health. You called for us every time you replaced a meal with caffeine. You called for us with every missed phone call from your family, every postponed vacation, every relationship that withered in the shadow of your ambition." "No," Satoshi protested, a flicker of his old, defiant self. That was the cost. That was the sacrifice. It was for the build, for the mission. The white-robed figures shifted, a collective, silent sigh. One of them drifted forward, separating from the pack. The light that formed its face pulsed, and for a heart-stopping second, Satoshi saw a flicker of a real face within it. His grandfather, dead 15 years. His expression not of love, but of simple, profound tiredness. "The mission," the chorus whispered, the voice now tinged with something like pity, "was to find an end. You ran from the small, messy, painful parts of life. You ran from grief. You ran from rest. You ran from your own broken heart. You ran so fast. You arrived here." The realization was not a flash of light. It was a slow, seeping cold. He hadn't been building a legacy. He had been building a mausoleum. He hadn't been chasing success. He had been fleeing life. He had, in his relentless pursuit of an impossible future, been unconsciously, meticulously, and efficiently engineering his own exit. He hadn't been calling for death. He'd just been calling for an end to the struggle, an end to the relentless pressure of his own potential. And this purple-grey stillness was the only logical, final end, the ultimate, passive income stream of non-existence. I didn't want this," he thought. The protest now weak, hollow. The man in the grey suit finally spoke. His voice, unlike the chorus, was singular. It was crisp, dry, and perfectly modulated. The voice of a man who has delivered the same quarterly report 1,000 times. "Want is a variable of the living. Satoshi, we deal only in outcomes. And the outcome is, you are here by your own metrics. The project is complete. You have successfully optimized for stillness. The man's words were the final audit, and like any audit, they were irrefutable. Satoshi looked at the circle of white figures, his board of directors, his silent stakeholders, all the ghosts of his own past. He saw his old mentor, who had worked himself into a heart attack. He saw a flicker of an ex-girlfriend, the one he'd let go because she didn't fit the 5-year plan. He saw all the people he had failed, not out of malice, but out of a complete and total consuming distraction. This was not a reunion, it was an alignment, a final, formal acknowledgement that he was, at last, one of them. He was not a visitor, he was a resident. The temptation, when it came, was not a fire. It was a slow, deep, comfortable chill. The circle of white light beings parted, a gap, a space, just for him. His grandfather, or the light shape that wore his memory, held out a hand made of soft, white energy. It was an invitation. The man in the grey suit gave a slight, permissive nod. "It's done," he said, his voice now softened, almost kind. "The work is over. You can rest. No more pitches, no more pivots, no more metrics, no more fundraising, no more what's next. Just stillness, just peace." Satoshi looked at the offered hand. The relief was suffocating. It was more powerful than any drug, more compelling than any ambition. The weight he had carried, the constant, grinding pressure to become, to achieve, to prove. It all dissolved. He could just stop, surrender, accept the acqui-hire. He could finally be done. He ached for it. He ached for the peace. His entire being, every burned-out neuron and exhausted synapse, screamed for him to take that hand, to join the circle, to become a white, silent, pulsing light, free of all striving. He looked at the hand of light. He thought of his life, the 3 a.m. coding sessions, the adrenaline buzz so sharp it tasted like metal, the rush of a successful launch, that one perfect moment where the server log scrolled green, the camaraderie of a team, exhausted and delirious in a conference room at dawn, the taste of cold coffee, the sharp, painful, vibrant sting of failure, the messy, chaotic, inefficient, and beautiful struggle. He looked back at the man in the grey suit. Was it worth it? He projected. The man in the grey suit allowed himself a thin, professional smile. Worth is a concept for the living. We only deal in results. The transaction is complete. Satoshi felt a new sensation, a tiny, hot, rebellious spark. It was not hope. It was annoyance. I am not a transaction, he thought. I am not a result. I am not a metric on your quarterly review. He looked at the glowing hand, still offered, still patient. The temptation to surrender was overwhelming. It was the most logical, most comfortable, most efficient choice, to give in, to rest. But a new, insane thought flickered in his mind. He looked at the endless, purple-grey void. He looked at the silent, static, white figures. This is it, he thought, the old, restless, founder's energy stirring. Just standing here forever. This is the eternal exit. It's boring. He could feel the man in the grey suit smile falter, as if he had just seen an unexpected line item in the budget. It is peace, the chorus whispered, a note of warning in the reverb. It's stagnation, Satoshi thought back, the spark growing. It's the end of the build cycle. It's maintenance mode, forever. He pulled his gaze from the glowing hand, an act that took more effort than any all-nighter he had ever pulled. He looked, square on, at the man in the grey suit. I'm not ready to be a legacy system, he projected, his own voice, for the first time, faint, rusty, and painfully human, echoing in the vast silent space between life and death. The purple-grey world, which had been so utterly still, seemed to shudder. The chorus of white lights flared, as if in sudden, collective alarm. The temptation had not passed. The hand was still offered. The piece was still his for the taking. But a new variable had been introduced into the final, perfect equation. A bug in the code, a flicker of will, the stubborn, illogical, and utterly human refusal to simply be done. The voice of Hana. The universe had dissolved. There was no up or down, no heat or cold. There was only a vast, neutral emptiness, a sensation of floating in an endless, starless void. The agonizing crimson that had seared his nerves, the psychic screams of the entity he had fought, the very memory of his own body, all of it had receded, becoming distant echoes, like a project deadline that had passed long ago, irrelevant and powerless. This, Satoshi thought with a sense of profound, weary relief, was peace. This was the finality he had craved, the cessation of striving, the end of the relentless hustle, the crushing weight of responsibility, the sleepless nights spent drawing sigils on a whiteboard until his hands bled. He had run the startup of his life into the ground. He had burned through his funding, his passion, and ultimately, his people. He had failed. And in this perfect, silent oblivion, failure was acceptable. There was no one left to disappoint. The market had corrected. The venture was over. He let himself drift. He was done. He didn't know how long he floated in that serene non-existence. Minutes, eons, it didn't matter. The silence was a balm. But then, something disturbed the perfection of the void. It began not as a sight, but as a feeling, a single, pure note of warmth against the absolute zero of his detachment. It was faint, like the first flicker of a viable idea in a brainstorming session full of dead ends. He resisted it. He recoiled. Warmth meant life. Life meant pain. Life meant trying. He had tried, and he had destroyed everything he touched. He was a walking catastrophe, a case study in burnout and hubris. He didn't deserve warmth. He deserved this cold, silent end. But the warmth persisted. It grew, not with the violent, consuming hunger of the crimson fire, but with the steady, insistent glow of a sunrise. The void, which had seemed infinite, now had a focal point. A light was blooming in the emptiness. It was a soft, pearlescent white, tinged with the pale gold of dawn. It did not threaten. It invited. Satoshi tried to turn away, to sink deeper into the comforting dark, but he had no body to command. He was a consciousness, a single point of awareness, and the light was now the only thing in his universe. It pulsed gently, and with each pulse, it brought something new into the void. Memory. Not the sharp, agonizing memories of failure, but the soft ones. The scent of jasmine tea in their cramped workspace. The sound of Yori's booming laughter after closing their first small contract. The quiet, focused tapping of Hannah's keyboard late at night. A beacon of shared purpose in the darkness. These memories hurt more than the entity's claws. This was the why he had betrayed. The light coalesced. It took on a shape, a form so gentle it barely disturbed the void. It was not an angel, not a deity. It was her, Hana, but not the Hana he remembered from the end, not the broken, hollowed-out vessel, her eyes vacant, her spirit consumed by the very darkness they had sought to control. This was Hana, the real Hana. She wore the simple, cream-coloured sweater she always favoured, the one she said was her lucky coding sweater. Her hair was tied back in the messy, practical bun she made when she was deep in concentration. She looked as she had on their best day, the day they'd launched their first platform, tired, triumphant, and so utterly, brilliantly alive. She was radiant, not with a divine, otherworldly fire, but with the simple, profound light of a good person at peace. Satoshi's consciousness convulsed, a scream without a mouth, a torrent of anguish without eyes to weep. Shame. It was a physical force, heavier than gravity, more toxic than poison. He was the CEO standing before the employee he had led to their death. He was the founder who had sold a vision and delivered a nightmare. He was the older brother who had promised to protect and who had fed his family to the wolves. He tried to flee, to dissolve himself, to erase his own existence before she could speak. He could not bear her judgment. No, please, not you. Anyone but you. She drifted closer, her feet not touching any floor. Her presence a gentle, undeniable reality. Her expression was not one of accusation. It was not anger. It was a deep, heartbreaking, and soul-shattering pity. She looked at him as one might look at a beloved brother who had lost his way, a brilliant mind trapped in a loop of self-destruction. "Satoshi," she said. Her voice, it wasn't an echo. It was real, clear, calm, and perfectly pitched. It cut through the void and struck the core of his being. The facade of his peace shattered, the cold detachment evaporated, and the pain rushed in, not the physical pain, but the psychic agony of his guilt. It was the pain of every ignored warning, every corner cut, every time he said, "We have to push harder," when he should have said, "We need to rest." "Hana." His voice was a rasp, a thought forced into sound. "Hana, I'm sorry." It was a pathetic word, a grain of sand offered against a tsunami of debt. "I am so sorry." He wept, his ethereal form trembling. "It was my fault, all of it. The project, the expansion. I didn't listen. Yori told me it was too fast. You told me the energy was unstable, but I saw the goal. I saw the launch. I saw the victory." He was rambling, a confession pouring into the void. "I wanted it so badly. I wanted us to win. I thought I could handle the risk. I thought I was strong enough to control it. I was arrogant. I was a fool. And you paid for it. Yori paid for it. All of you." He choked on the names, the faces, the team he had built and broken. I'm sorry, Hana. I failed you. I failed all of you." He felt small, a petulant, ambitious child who had broken his favourite toy. Only the toy was their lives. He expected her to rage, to scream, to condemn him. He deserved it. Hana simply watched him, her gaze unwavering, letting his confessions spill into the silence. She let him empty himself, let the poison of his hubris drain out. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a terrible, knowing sadness. She understood his drive. She had shared it. That, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy. When he was finished, trembling in the silence, she raised a hand, not to strike, but to comfort. Her translucent fingers brushed against his immaterial cheek. The touch was like a drop of pure water on a parched tongue. "I know," she whispered. "We know." "Then let me stay," he pleaded, the words tearing from him. "Please, I don't want to go back. I can't face it. Let me stay here, with you, whatever this is. Let me be here and atone. Let me just be gone." He tried to cling to her, to the peace she represented. To be with her was to be forgiven, to be finished. Hana's gentle expression held. She let him hold on to that hope for a single, aching moment. She let him feel the peace of her presence, the absolution he so desperately craved. Then, her eyes hardened. It was not a hardening of anger, but of resolve. The resolve she'd had when debugging a catastrophic code failure. The resolve of a leader. The pity in her eyes was replaced by a profound, non-negotiable command. Her hand on his cheek became firm, holding his gaze. "Brother." The word hung in the absolute stillness. He felt the shift. The air, which wasn't air, grew taut. This was not the comfort of a friend. This was the gravity of a final verdict. She held his eyes. He saw the infinite sadness there, the shared loss, the love. And he saw the steel beneath it. A pause, a held breath that spanned an eternity. "You can't stay here." It was not a suggestion. It was not a debate. It was a law of this universe, delivered with the devastating finality of a gavel fall. It hit him harder than any physical blow. It was rejection. It was his greatest desire. Denied. What? He stammered. No, please, Hannah, you don't understand. There's nothing left. I have nothing to go back to. I'm done. No, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. We are done. Our journey is over. We are at peace. Satoshi, this emptiness you crave, this isn't for you. You wouldn't find peace here. You would only find an eternity of your own failure. This isn't atonement. It's desertion. He flinched, the words striking him like a slap. Desertion. You're right, she continued, her voice softening again, the leader stepping back, the sister stepping forward. You failed us. You were arrogant. You were blind. You were a terrible leader. Each word was a precise, clean cut. He waited for the final blow. But you are our brother, she finished, and you are alive. I don't want to be, he whispered. Shame and defiance warring within him. What's the point? Everyone is gone. We are not gone, Hannah said, and for the first time, she gestured to the light that surrounded her. It pulsed, and within it, for just a flicker, Satoshi saw them. He saw Yori, not roaring in battle, but smiling, raising a glass in a toast. He saw the others, the whole team, not as ghosts, but as complete at rest. We are here, and we are waiting, but not for you, not like this. She moved closer, her form so bright it was almost painful to behold. She was the embodiment of their shared dream, the pure, uncorrupted why of their entire endeavor. You have a new project. Satoshi, a new mission. What? What are you talking about? You must live, she said, her voice clear and absolute. You must go back. You must carry us, not as a burden, not as a ghost, but as a part of you. You must carry our story, our memory. She saw the incomprehension on his face and elaborated, her words becoming the new architecture of his reality. Your life is the only vessel left. If you stay here, if you choose this empty void, we all die. The idea dies. The struggle, the sacrifice, the dream, all of it vanishes. It means nothing. Just another failed venture, forgotten by time. She pressed her ethereal forehead to his. Don't let our memory die with you in this darkness. Let it live with you in the light. Go back, build again, not the same thing. Something new, something better, something wiser. Live the life we didn't get to. That is your atonement. He looked at her, at the impossible, crushing weight she was placing on him. It was a burden so much heavier than death. It was the burden of legacy. I can't, he breathed. I'm not strong enough, Hannah. Look what I did. I'll just fail again. Probably, she said, and a flicker of her old, wry smile touched her lips. It was devastating. You probably will fail again, and again. That's what entrepreneurs do. That's what we did. But you'll get up, you'll pivot, you'll learn. This time, you won't be doing it for yourself. You'll be doing it for us. She held him, a final, heartbreaking embrace. She whispered, using the formal, respectful term. My brother, we forgive you for your failure, but we will never forgive you if you give up. Now, go, live. Satoshi looked at her face, memorizing the light, the peace, the unbearable love. He saw the truth. To die here was the easy way. It was the coward's exit. It was the final, unforgivable failure. Living was the work. Living was the only thing that mattered. The tears that came now were different. They were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of acceptance, a baptism in the void. He nodded, a single, sharp movement of his entire being. The choice was made. His apology, when it came this time, was not a plea. It was a promise. I'm sorry, he said, his voice finding a new, raw strength. And I will not fail you again. Hana smiled. A true, radiant smile. It was the brightest thing in the universe. I know. Live well, brother. She did not vanish. She simply receded. The light that was her became the light of the entire void, brightening, expanding, pushing out the darkness. The warmth became an intense, roaring pressure. He was no longer floating. He was falling, or perhaps being pulled. The serene, neutral emptiness was gone, replaced by a violent, agonizing sensation of return. The cold was no longer a concept, it was a physical shock, sharp as knives. The silence was shattered by a deafening roar, the sound of wind, of falling stone, of his own blood rushing back into his ears. Pain. Oh, God, the pain. It was blinding. Every nerve ending, which had been blissfully numb, ignited in a symphony of agony. His ribs were shattered. His lungs were on fire. The smell of ozone and ash filled his nostrils. He was heavy. He was solid. He was matter. With a gasp that felt like swallowing broken glass, Satoshi's eyes snapped open. He was not in the void. He was in the ruins of the temple. The red, cancerous glow of the entity was gone, banished. The oppressive storm had broken. Through a jagged hole in the ceiling, he could see the first, faint, grey light of dawn. He was alive. He lay there for a long moment, pinned beneath a block of rubble, every breath a fresh wave of torture. He was broken. He was alone. He was at rock bottom, the founder of a smoking crater. But he was alive, and for the first time, in a very, very long time, he knew exactly what his mission was. Satoshi closed his eyes, took one agonizing, purposeful breath, and began the work of getting up. Back to the living world, the first thing that registered was the smell. It wasn't the damp, sulphurous decay of the other place. It was antiseptic, sharp, with an underlying hint of diesel fumes. It was the smell of the living. Satoshi's eyes opened to a sterile white ceiling. The fluorescent light above hummed a low, consistent B-flat, a sound so aggressively mundane it felt like a violation. He was on a gurney. A rough wool blanket, dyed a functional hospital blue, was scratching his chin. His body ached, not with the soul-deep chill of that place, but with the simple, honest pain of exhaustion, muscle fatigue, joint stiffness, gravity. A man in a paramedic's uniform was checking a monitor beside him. He spoke in clipped, professional tones, not to Satoshi, but to someone else just out of sight. Vitals are stable, mild hypothermia, severe dehydration, but he's here. He's back. Back. The word hung in the air, a flimsy bridge over an impossible chasm. He had been found by a search and rescue team at the base of the mountain, miles from the abandoned village, unconscious in a tangle of frost-covered brush. They said he'd been missing for 72 hours. Satoshi knew, in the marrow of his bones, that it had been years. The journey back to Tokyo was a blur of processed paperwork, lukewarm tea in paper cups, and the steady, rhythmic vibration of a train. He sat by the window, watching the blur of the countryside resolve itself into the dense, electric sprawl of the city. He was a ghost of a different kind now. The city was exactly as he had left it, which felt like the ultimate betrayal. The 314 express to Shinjuku was still crowded. Salarymen in identical dark suits still stared, hypnotized at their glowing phones, their thumbs scrolling through worlds of data, blissfully unaware of the worlds that pulsed just beneath the skin of their reality. The advertisements screamed at him with a desperate, colourful cheer. Buy this drink, use this credit card, join this gym. The noise. God, the noise. It was a physical assault. The clatter of the train on the tracks, the automated announcements, the quiet murmur of 100 simultaneous, pointless conversations. In that village, the silence had been a predator, a living thing that waited to devour him. Here, the noise was a shield, a thick, padded wall of stimuli designed to keep reality at bay. He unlocked the door to his apartment. It was a 1K in a nondescript building in Nakano, a perfect little box for a life put on pause. A thin layer of dust covered everything. A stack of mail lay by the door, mostly bills and promotional flyers. His old life, waiting patiently in paper form. He stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Hours, perhaps. The sun tracked across the floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. This was the beginning of what he would later come to understand as survivor's peace. It was not a gentle, soaring, orchestral peace. It was not the peace of resolution. It was the peace of an evacuated city after a bombardment. It was the absolute, deafening stillness that follows the cessation of unbearable, relentless trauma. For the first few days, he just existed. He slept. He slept for 14, then 16 hours at a time. It was not rest. It was a function. His body's desperate attempt to reclaim the energy that had been siphoned from it. When he was awake, he would sit on his small balcony, watching the city breathe. He would make coffee, focusing on the ritual, the grinding of the beans, the precise pour of the hot water. He was anchoring himself to the physical world, one small, tactile sensation at a time. The silence of his apartment was his new adversary. It was in this silence that the echoes returned, the whisper of a name, the sight of a shadow moving in his peripheral vision. He would flinch, his heart seizing, only to find it was just the curtain moving in the breeze from the air conditioner. He was a man who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, but the smoke still clung to him. He had returned to the land of the living, but he hadn't yet rejoined it. He was in recovery. Anyone who has ever poured their entire being into a single venture, a startup, a creative project, a relationship, only to watch it implode, knows this silence. It is the void left behind when the all-consuming why of your life is suddenly ripped away. The hustle, the fight, the desperate scramble for survival. It becomes your identity, and when it's gone, you are left with nothing but the terrifying, uncharted territory of yourself. Satoshi had spent so long fighting to get back to a normal life that he had forgotten he no longer knew how to live one. The call came a week after his return. A text message, actually, from Harada, a former colleague from his old agency. The glowing rectangle in his hand felt alien, a piece of technology from a different civilization. "Hey, Satoshi, heard you were back in town. A few of us are grabbing ramen for lunch at Ippudo tomorrow, 12:30. You in?" His thumb hovered over the keyboard. His old life was knocking. It was a simple, casual invitation. For Satoshi, it felt like being asked to walk on the moon, lunch, with people who talked about deadlines and client feedback and what they watched on Netflix last night. How could he possibly sit across from them and talk about spreadsheets when his mind was still trying to process the geometry of a room that held no right angles? He thought about ignoring it. He thought about lying, claiming he was still unwell. It would be easy. They would understand. But survival isn't a single event. It's a series of choices. He had survived the village. Now he had to survive the return. "Yeah, sounds good. See you then." The restaurant was loud. The cheerful shouted greetings of "Irashaimasu" from the staff, the clatter of bowls, the hiss of the noodle boilers, the boisterous laughter from a nearby table of salarymen. It was the sound of life, unbothered and mundane. Harada waved him over. "Satoshi-san, man, it's been, what, 2 years? You look different." He was sitting with 2 others, Masuda, from marketing, and Haruo, a designer. They were older now. Masuda had less hair. Haruo had a new, expensive-looking watch. Life had moved on. Satoshi slid into the booth. "Yeah, it's been a while." There it was, the inevitable, awkward pause. They knew he had been gone. The official story was that he'd taken an extended leave of absence for family reasons after Hannah's death. Then, just disappeared. They knew he'd been through something. But these were men of the professional world. They respected boundaries. You don't pry. You don't ask the questions you don't want to answer yourself. "Well, it's good to see you." Harada said, handing him a menu. The Akamaru is still the best. And just like that, the moment passed. The conversation resumed, and Satoshi was swept into the current of their world. So the client shot down the entire Q3 proposal. Masuda was complaining, vigorously mixing the garlic into his broth. Said the metrics weren't disruptive enough. What does that even mean? It means they read a new buzzword in an article. Haruo grunted, not looking up from his phone. Just add synergy and AI-driven to the deck and send it back. They won't even read it. Speaking of AI, Harada chimed in. Did you see that new text-to-video model? It's getting scary good. We might all be out of a job in 5 years. Satoshi just listened. He ordered the Akamaru. He picked up his chopsticks. The conversation washed over him. It was a language he used to be fluent in, a dialect of ambition, minor office politics, and technological anxiety. It had been his entire world. It was the very thing he had been running from, and the very thing he had been fighting to return to. Now, it just sounded like noise. But it was, for the first time, a comforting noise. It was the sound of a system that worked, a world that followed predictable rules. Clients were difficult, deadlines were tight, ramen was good. How about you? Satoshi? Haruo asked, finally putting his phone down. You thinking of getting back into the game, or just taking it easy? Satoshi looked down at his bowl. The steam rose in a gentle curl. He thought of the cold, suffocating mist of the village. He thought of the faces in the shadows. He thought of the weight that had crushed him for so long, the weight of a past he couldn't escape and a future he couldn't imagine. I'm just having lunch, Satoshi said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Harada nodded, a small, knowing smile. Right. Well, eat up. The first bowl back is always the best. He wasn't part of their world, not anymore. He was an outsider, an observer, but he was there. He was present. He was sitting at a table with other living, breathing human beings. Sharing a meal, he was not running, he was not fighting, he was just being. This was the first day of his new life. He walked back to his apartment instead of taking the train. The afternoon sun was warm, and the city seemed different. The hustle of Shinjuku no longer felt like an assault. It was just energy. It was the market, the great, chaotic, beautiful system of human endeavor, people building things, selling things, loving and losing and moving on. He found himself walking through a small, quiet park, tucked between two towering office buildings. Mothers watched their children play on a brightly colored slide. An old man practiced Tai Chi under a ginkgo tree. Satoshi reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against the worn, smooth corner of the photograph. He pulled it out, the photo of Hana. It was faded, the corners soft from years of being carried. Her smile, once a source of unbearable, crippling grief, looked different to him now. For years, this photo had been a burden. It was his guilt, his failure. It was the anchor that had tethered him to the past, the weakness that the other place had exploited. It was the weight that had dragged him down into the darkness, the symbol of a life he had lost and could never reclaim. He looked at her face, really looked at it, perhaps for the first time as a survivor rather than a victim. The grief was still there. It would always be there. It was a part of him now, a scar on his soul. But the weight was gone. The crushing, suffocating obligation to remain broken had lifted. This picture was no longer an anchor. It was a compass. This was the symbol of rebirth. Rebirth isn't about becoming new. It's not about erasing the past or forgetting the pain. It's not about a clean slate. That's a fantasy for children. Rebirth, for those who have truly been to the brink, is about integration. It is the act of looking at the wreckage of your past, the failures, the losses, the trauma, and refusing to let it define your future. It's the process of accepting the scar, of understanding that you are not weaker for having it, but profoundly stronger. The wound is where the light enters. Hannah's memory was no longer a chain. It was a foundation. He had survived for her, and now he would live for himself, carrying her with him not as a ghost, but as a part of his own, hard-won strength. He had been to the place where dreams and ambitions go to die. He had faced the literal personification of his own grief and despair, and he had walked out. The world was loud and complicated and full of deadlines and metrics he no longer understood, but it was also full of sunlight and hot ramen and the simple, profound privilege of another breath. Satoshi slipped the photo back into his pocket. It felt light. He took a deep breath of the polluted, vibrant Tokyo air, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt it fill his lungs. He turned his face toward the sun and began the long, quiet, ordinary walk home. The woman of Hachioji Castle. This is a complex and substantial request. Crafting a 2,500-word narrative in a specific documentary horror tone for a sophisticated, almost professional audience requires a deep dive into historical context, psychological horror, and thematic resonance. Here is the complete chapter, written as continuous prose, designed to bridge your previous work and serve as a compelling, standalone piece for your video. The woman of Hachioji Castle. The psychic residue of Aokigahara is a cold, damp static. It clings to you. It is the sound of a million private chumchumkwas, whispered sorrows coalescing into a single sighing void. To walk out of the Jukai, the sea of trees, is to emerge from a database of modern despair, a place where individuals go to be erased, to have their stories deliberately terminated. The forest is a final page, ripped out. But the weight of those torn pages remains. I, Michael, had spent weeks cataloguing that silence, trying to map the contours of deliberate oblivion. The work was heavy, a spiritual excavation that left me drained, my senses attuned to the frequency of acute, personal loss. But the echo that drew me east, away from the shadow of Mount Fuji, was different. It was not a whisper, it was a scream. This new signal was not the hum of countless separate tragedies. It was a singular, cataclysmic event, a moment of such concentrated violence and despair that it had permanently fractured the landscape. It was a shriek trapped in amber, playing on a loop for over 4 centuries. I was leaving a forest of personal choice for a fortress of collective trauma. I was heading to Hachioji Castle, historical echo. To understand the ghost, you must first understand the ground. The soil of Hachioji is not neutral, it is an archive. The castle itself, or what remains of it, sits on Shiroyama Mountain, a strategic vantage point overlooking the Kanto Plain. Today, it is a place of serene, melancholic beauty. Moss covers the crumbling stone foundations, designated a National Historic Site. A single elegant wooden bridge, a modern reconstruction, spans a ravine leading to the former main keep. The Goshuden. Families hike the trails, tourists take photographs. It is a place of peace. But this peace is a thin veneer plastered over a memory of absolute carnage. In 1590, Japan was being forged in the crucible of war. The warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi was on the final step of his ambitious campaign to unify the nation. Only one major obstacle remained: the powerful Hojo clan, masters of the Kanto region, who defied him from their impregnable fortress at Odawara. Hachioji Castle was their crucial western satellite, a massive, complex mountain fortification. It was the key to the Kanto. Hideyoshi, a master of both strategy and psychological warfare, knew that to break the Hojo, he had to make an example, while the main Hojo army, led by clan leader Hojo Ujimasa and his heir Ujinao, hunkered down for a protracted siege at Odawara. Hachioji was left defended by a skeleton force. The castle lord, Hojo Ujiteru, was himself at Odawara, leaving his home in the care of a few thousand retainers and, crucially, their families. On June 23, 1590, Hideyoshi's forces, a massive army of 50,000 men led by his top generals, Maeda Toshiie and Wasugi Kagekatsu, descended on the 3,000 defenders of Hachioji. The attack was not a siege, it was an annihilation. It began at dawn. The disparity in numbers was a mathematical certainty of death. The main force stormed the castle gates while a second detachment, guided by local sympathizers, scaled the sheer cliffs at the rear, bypassing the primary defenses. The castle was breached from all sides simultaneously. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Hojo samurai fought with the desperate courage of the doomed, but they were methodically overwhelmed. As the outer defences fell and the Hideyoshi troops poured into the main citadel, the reality of their fate became clear. For the inhabitants of Hachioji, capture by Hideyoshi's army was not an option. For the samurai, it was dishonour. For the women and children, it was a fate perceived as worse than death. And so, the historical record, a dry, passionless document, notes that the castle's inhabitants, including Hojo Uzujiteru's wife and the retainers' families, began a systematic, ritualized mass suicide. They fled to the highest point, the site of the Goshuden, the Lord's residence. There, as the battle raged below, they enacted the final horrific ritual of their caste. Women killed their children and then themselves. The men who were not fighting joined them. The Goshuden had a waterfall, the Goshuden no Taki, which still flows today. According to legend, the women and children threw themselves into the cascade, their bodies and blood choking the stream. It is said the waterfall ran red for 3 days and 3 nights. When the castle finally fell by mid-afternoon, a fortress designed to hold for months, taken in less than a day, Hideyoshi's men found the waterfall clogged with the pale, broken bodies of hundreds of women and children. The castle was burned to the ground. The Hojo clan, hearing of the incomprehensible speed and brutality of Hachioji's fall, and seeing the severed heads of its defenders displayed outside their own gates, lost their will to fight. They surrendered. Hachioji was the blow that broke the back of the last resistance. Hideyoshi's unification was complete. History moved on. The castle was abandoned, its stones reclaimed by the forest. But the event, the sheer density of the trauma, was too great. The land remembered, the echo remained. This was the story that had obsessed Haruo Masuda for 2 decades. Haruo was not a mystic. He was not a paranormal investigator in the Western sense, armed with blinking gadgets and a desire for fame. He was a local historian, a man in his late 50s with the quiet, persistent nature of a scholar and the pragmatic mindset of an entrepreneur. His startup was a single, obsessive project to prove that folklore was not fantasy, but a data stream of human experience that history books, written by the victors, had chosen to ignore. For Haruo, the official account of Hachioji was incomplete. It was a list of victors, losers, and dates. It was an entry in a ledger. But the legend, the persistent local story of a wailing woman by the waterfall, the spectral soldiers still sighted on the foggy paths, the oppressive weight that visitors reported, that was the human truth of the event. It was the unprocessed emotional data of the massacre. He had spent years collecting anecdotal evidence, cross-referencing folklore with genealogical records and obscure temple logs from the 16th century. He was looking for a signal in the noise. He was looking for a name. Because history, Haruo believed, records statistics. But ghosts are not statistics. A ghost is an individual. A ghost is a name without a grave. A ghost is a story that has been interrupted. He had recently found a fragment, a footnote in a local temple's birth and death registry, burned and water damaged, dating to the late 1580s. It was a partial list of retainers serving the Hojo family, residents of the castle town. One line, barely legible, mentioned a low-ranking samurai. Beside his name were two others, Atsuko, his wife, and Takao, their son, aged 3. It was a lead, a fragile thread, but for Haruo, it was the beginning of an answer. He believed that the unquiet dead did not linger because of a place, but because of a purpose. They were not an echo, they were an unresolved question, and the famous wailing woman of Hachioji, he theorized, was not an abstract manifestation of the tragedy. She was a specific person. He believed she was Atsuko, mother's grief. My own research led me to Haruo's work. I found his meticulously kept blog, a dry academic repository of his findings. It was a chronicle of obsession. He treated the haunting with the seriousness of an archaeologist excavating a forgotten tomb. We, as content creators, often seek the spectacular. Haruo sought the specific. He wanted to replace the myth with the person. I contacted him, and after a lengthy, skeptical exchange, he agreed to meet. He was wary, seeing me as another sensationalist. I assured him my interest was the same as his, to understand the mechanics of memory. I arrived at Hachioji on a heavy, overcast afternoon in late October. The air was thick with humidity, and the atmosphere of the mountain was immediately apparent. It is a suffocating place. The word haunted is insufficient. It is saturated. The air feels pressurized, as if the events of 1590 are still displacing the oxygen. Haruo was waiting for me at the small museum near the mountain's base. He was a slight man, precise in his movements, and he carried a heavy-duty audio recorder and a leather-bound notebook. "You must understand," he said, bypassing introductions, his English formal and exact. "This is not a theme park. The people who died here were real. The forces at work here are not entertainment. They are a consequence." We began the climb. The path to the Goshuden ruins is steep, winding through dense, dark cedar trees. The reconstructed bridge over the ravine is beautiful, but it feels wrong. A clean, new bandage on a festering wound. As we crossed it, Haruo stopped. The original bridge was here. He motioned to the ravine below. It was the main choke point. They held the attackers here for almost an hour, fighting hand to hand, until the detachment scaled the cliffs from behind. The men fighting here didn't even know the castle had already fallen. They were dying for a citadel that was already lost. This was the nature of Hachioji, layers of futility, of desperate, meaningless courage. We reached the summit, the site of the Lord's residence. All that remains are the massive stone foundations, like the skeleton of a beached whale, and at the far end, tucked into a mossy grotto, is the waterfall, the Goshuden no Taki. It is not a grand cascade. It is a delicate, continuous flow of water spilling over a dark, stone cliff face, collecting in a small, clear pool. A statue of a bodhisattva has been placed beside it, an offering of peace, but the air around it is ice cold. "This is the epicenter," Haruo said, his voice dropping. He set up his audio recorder, placing the microphone on a tripod aimed at the falling water. "The local people say you must never come here at night. They say the screaming starts again. Not just one, hundreds." "And you?" I asked. "I have been here many times. I have recorded anomalous audio. I have felt the temperature drops." He checked his notebook. "But I have never seen her, not clearly. I believe she is not a visual phenomenon. She is an emotional one, a psychic imprint." We waited as the sun began to dip, the grey sky turning to a deep, bruised purple. The park was closing. The last of the hikers had gone. We were alone on the mountain. The forest, which had been alive with the sound of birds and insects, fell utterly silent. The only sound was the splash of the waterfall, and then that sound began to change. It was subtle at first. The clear, high-pitched splash seemed to deepen, to become thicker, more viscous. A low-frequency hum began to emanate from the stones, a sound so low I felt it in my chest rather than heard it with my ears. Haruo was stock still, watching his recorder. the levels on its small screen peeking into the red. "It's starting," he whispered. A smell rolled in. It was not the damp earth of the forest. It was the coppery, metallic reek of old blood. And beneath it, the acrid scent of wood smoke. I was no longer standing in a park. The air itself had become a recording. I could hear shouting, distant and thin, the clash of steels. It was the historical echo, the data stream Haruo had spoken of, bleeding into the present. "Haruo," I said, my voice tight. "The waterfall." He looked up. The water, which had been clear, now seemed dark. In the fading light, it looked oily, sluggish, and standing at the edge of the pool, looking not at us, but into the water, was a figure. It was, as Haruo had predicted, not a solid thing. It was a distortion in the air, a human-shaped space where the light seemed to bend incorrectly. It was a woman, her hair matted and long, her kimono torn and dark, stained with mud, or perhaps something else. She was weeping. It was not a human sound. It was a sound of absolute cyclical despair, a grief so profound it had become a force of nature, like the waterfall itself. She paced the edge of the pool, her movements frantic and repetitive. She would bend down, as if to pick something up from the water, her hands closing on nothing. Then she would straighten, look around, her head turning in sharp, bird-like movements, and the terrible, broken wail would begin again. She was searching. "Atsuko," Haruo said. It was not a question. The figure froze. The wailing stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the sound had been. The distortion turned. It had no face, just a smudge of deeper shadow. But we both felt the focus of its attention. It was the first time in 400 years. I realized that this process had been interrupted. It drifted toward us. It was not floating. It was simply moving, gliding over the uneven stones without displacing anything. The cold was now unbearable, a physical pressure that made my teeth ache. Haruo did not back away. He was terrified. I could see his hands trembling, but his resolve was absolute. This was the moment his entire life's work had led to. The figure stopped a few feet from him. The air crackled, and a voice, not in the air, but inside my head, a dry, frantic, static-filled whisper, formed a single thought. "Where is he? Have you seen him? My son, Takao." Promise to remember this is the central transaction of unresolved hauntings. It is not an attack. It is a demand for information. It is a corrupted file, seeking to be read. It is a question, echoing endlessly until it finds an answer. Haruo, to his credit, understood this. He was not an exorcist come to banish a demon. He was a historian, an archivist, come to close a loop. He unzipped his bag, his hands shaking so much he fumbled with the pull. He took out his leather-bound notebook. He opened it to a bookmarked page. "I know your name," Haruo said, his voice loud and clear in the suffocating silence. The figure tilted its head, the distortion wavering. "My son, where is Takao?" They took him. The men, the smoke. The time bleed was intensifying. The smell of smoke was overwhelming. I could hear the crackle of fire. The figure of Atsuko was becoming more defined, her form solidifying as she drew on the energy of the memory, or perhaps on our own. "Your name is Atsuko," Haruo said, reading from his notes, his voice a steady anchor in the psychic storm. "Your husband was a retainer. You lived in the castle town. You came here for safety." The figure cringed. "Safety. Yes, the walls. He said we would be safe. The castle fell," Haruo stated. He was not gentle. He was delivering a historical fact. "It was June 23rd, 1590. The army of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, they breached the walls." "No, we are safe," he said. He said. The figure clutched its head. The wailing began again, a sound of pure denial. Atsuko, Haruo shouted. It is over. It ended. You died here. You died in this place. I died? The whisper was one of profound confusion. No, I must find Takao. He was with me, by the water. I was holding his hand. A new memory, not mine, flashed in my mind. The Goshuden, filled with screaming women, the smell of fire, soldiers, their armor black, storming the residence, a frantic crush of bodies. Atsuko, holding a small boy's hand, being pushed, stumbling, losing her grip. The boy, Takao, falling into the chaos, swallowed by the panicked crowd. I lost him. The psychic scream was a physical blow. I lost him. He is gone. Atsuko, Haruo said, his voice softening, but his message firm. He died here, with you, your son, Takao. He had found the name, the trigger, the key. This, I realized, was the promise to remember. It was not a vow to the future. It was an acknowledgement of the past. It was the act of naming, in this place. Hundreds had died, becoming an anonymous mass, a single bloody statistic. But Haruo, through his work, had pulled one person from that statistic. He had given her back her name and the name of her son. He had validated her grief by restoring her identity. The figure of Atsuko stopped its frantic searching. It stood perfectly still. The oppressive weight on the mountain, the pressure in the air, seemed to draw inward, focusing on her. The distortions around her form wavered violently. She looked at Haruo, and for a moment, the shadow cleared. I saw a face, not a monster, not a spectre, but a young woman. Her face pale, stained with tears and smoke. A mother, Takao. She whispered his name. It was not a question this time. It was a statement, a memory, and then she simply dissolved. The air did not crackle. There was no flash of light. It was more like a sigh. The cold vanished. The smell of blood and smoke evaporated. The waterfall sound returned to its normal, clear splash. The heavy, pressurized silence of the forest was replaced by the distant, familiar sounds of the living city in the valley below. It was over. The loop was broken. Haruo sagged against the stone railing, finally letting out the breath he'd been holding. He was pale, but his eyes were clear. He looked at his audio recorder. It was still running. We walked down the mountain in the dark, in silence. There was nothing to say. Haruo had not just recorded history, he had participated in it. He had taken a 400-year-old echo and, by fulfilling its purpose, had given it permission to fade. My work in Hachioji was done. Michael, the narrator, had his story, but I was left with a chilling, clarifying thought. Atsuko was an echo of love, a mother's grief so powerful it had chained her to the world. Her haunting was a question, born of loss. But as I left the mountain, I felt a new line of inquiry, a new thread pulling me. Hachioji was a scream of collective trauma, focused into one individual. But what about the opposite? What about a darkness that was not born of love, but of pure, undiluted rage? What about a haunting that isn't an echo, but a virus, a curse that is not bound to a single or tragic event, but is self-replicating, moving from person to person, from house to house, a story that doesn't want to be remembered, but wants only to consume? The scream of Hachioji had faded, replaced by a new signal. It was a low, guttural rattle, the sound of a throat cut. The trail was leading me away from the grand fortresses of history and into the quiet, unassuming suburbs of modern Tokyo. It was leading me to a place defined not by a mother's loss, but by a vow of unending fury. It was leading me to a simple, two-story house in Narima. What do you think? Is it possible that every spirit is just a story that desperately needs a witness, a memory that refuses to be forgotten? In many cultures, the line between our world and the next is blurred, defined not by death, but by memory. A soul isn't truly gone as long as it is remembered. This spiritual context suggests that a haunting isn't an attack, but an echo, a final attempt to be seen and acknowledged before fading completely. It's a powerful, and perhaps comforting, philosophy. It implies that the most terrifying thing isn't the act of dying, but the absolute silence of being forgotten. If you believe our memories have the power to offer peace, what are your thoughts on this? We truly want to know. Leave your reflections in the comments below. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the stories that are still waiting to be told.